Hello! In this lecture, we will be looking at Big Era 5 patterns of interregional unity from 300 to 1500 CE. This is the first point at which we are dealing with history entirely in the current era. Also, notice on this timeline that the eras in general are getting shorter. If you can imagine more and more things happening in the human experience during each successive era, that makes sense. As we can see on this map, what characterizes Big Era 5 is interregional patterns of unity. Interregional refers to the connections between regions or areas. Think trade, diffusion, and conquest as being those connections. These areas here, those are regions, areas of the world. At the start of Big Era 5, inventions, trade goods, ideas, and religions were spreading significantly from their regions of origin, from where they began. This spread would continue all across Afro-Eurasia as part of cultural exchange or diffusion. There were four major aspects of cultural exchange: population increasing and migration, trade networks and urbanization, sharing of ideas, and empires joining different groups of people under a single government. In the following slides, we'll take a look at each of these causes closer. World population almost doubled during Big Era 5. So if you notice here, from 200 CE to 1500 CE, the dates in Big Era 5, population was around 250 million in 200 CE and almost 500 million by the time 1500 CE began. To understand the population size and context of today, 460 million as the world's population in 1500 CE is about the same as the population in North America in the last decade. But our ability to extract and utilize resources was still relatively limited. So 460 million would still spur urbanization and migration. In comparison to area, you can see by this graph that the American population was much lower than the population in Afro-Eurasia. So down here at the bottom, we have the population in the Americas. That's North America, Central America, and South America. And we contrast this to what the population was in Afro-Eurasia at the same time. So you can see there are many more people in Afro-Eurasia than in the Americas during this time period. Because of that limited population, cultural exchange or diffusion was less extensive in the Americas than in Afro-Eurasia. So let's look at Afro-Eurasia first. One of the effects of population growth was the impact on the environment in the form of deforestation. This was an effect that will cause countries to seek out lumber resources elsewhere, often by conquest. Just as a side note, deforestation is when you completely cut down a forest and don't provide any opportunity for it to regrow. The reason deforestation often caused countries to seek out lumber resources elsewhere is because without enough trees, construction, heat, pottery, metalworking all shut down. Also, the soil eroded and river flooding became more devastating. Famines were also created because of deforestation. As people and groups left one area for another, the environment in the new area was also affected. Specifically, we can see some major migratory groups, often in the form of conquest, on this map. So here we have the Vikings up here in Northern Europe, going off towards Iceland and Greenland, heading more towards Russia, going down into France and into Spain. We have Germanic tribes going over here into Italy. We have Arab groups going through northern Africa and into Arabia and Middle Eastern countries, Pakistan. We have Turkish groups coming down into areas eventually over here, which will be the Ottoman Empire. And we also see the Mongols coming down into Chinese areas. So what we see are lots of groups of people moving, looking for more resources. How did migrating groups of people encourage cultural exchange or diffusion? Well, sometimes they would kick out the people who lived in a particular place. They'd bring with them new crops or animals. They also brought new technology that they used for farming, crafting, and warring, and they also brought their own languages and cultures. The cultures and languages and traditions of the people that they were conquering, they would also adopt. Another important takeaway from Big Era 5 is that over the 1,200 years, many giant empires came and went. Global changes in power occurred every few hundred years. Now remember that the US has only been around for about 250 years. Are we due for a major political upheaval, or do you think the United States will always be here? As new groups overtook existing groups, they often used the existing infrastructure and technology, adding it to their own. In this slide, we see the empires that existed in 600 CE. So this is 600 CE. We see Ghana here in Africa and Axum. We no longer see an Egyptian empire, but instead we see the Byzantine Empire. We see a kingdom called the Avar Kingdom, some Frankish kingdoms in modern-day France. The Sassanid Empire, which will is an Islamic empire. We see a couple different empires here in India. We see Sui China in China, and we see some groups in Korea and in Japan. Now let's compare that to the next slide. Only 200 years later, in 800 CE, we see a big difference. So let me just go back. Notice the different colors here and where these are, and then let's just go back to the slide before it. Oh, it's not letting me. There we go. So take a look at this and then how it's changed. So here we've got this caliphate, which again is an Islamic caliphate, and it is all through the Middle East here, through what is present-day Saudi Arabia, up through northern Africa. We have another caliphate here. This is also Muslim up in Spain. The Byzantine Empire has shrunk. The Ghana Empire, Axum Empire still exist. These two empires still exist in modern-day Korea, but things have changed in China, things have changed in India, and things have changed in Japan. Let's compare this to a few hundred years later even. In 1237 BC, this is about 400 years later than the map that we just saw, we see that the Mongols have come through and taken over almost all of at least northern China, into the Mideast, even into Europe here. We see a new empire emerging called Russia. We see some more familiar names here. We see France, we see Spain, we see England, Scandinavian kingdoms, Poland, Hungary, Portugal, Ethiopia, Mali, Angkor. These are all names that we're familiar with, Zimbabwe. But again, these will also be changing because Big Era 5 and World Civ is all about change. A couple hundred years after that, we see some shrinkage. Many empires have now disappeared. Notice the Mongol Empire is no longer there. We have new empires popping up. We have this new empire called the Ottoman Empire here. We have Hungary, the Holy Roman Empire, France, Russian states, Scotland now. So we're just seeing lots of different changes because that's the name of the game in World Civ. This fluctuation of empires and smaller states stimulated cultural exchange. Wars caused groups to come up with new technologies to overcome other groups. In the process, there was destruction, but also innovation. Strong governments like the Romans and the Mongols protected trade routes and stabilized currencies. This allowed physical ways culture could be exchanged along trade routes. As governments became stronger and richer, they started to fund the sciences, religious institutions, and the arts, sometimes employing scholars from around the world. Empires connected many disparate peoples with different languages, religions, and culture. Trade was one of the major ways culture was exchanged during this time and now. Cities grew as centers of trade within themselves, so trade within the city and then also trade between cities. Here's a sort of an overview map of some of the major trade routes in Afro-Eurasia during Big Era 5. You can see how extensive they were, both overland and in the Indian Ocean. Now, obviously, these are giant lines on this map. This isn't a very accurate map, but it gives you an idea of some of the networks, at least what areas were being linked to each other. So I don't want you to imagine like a highway system. Instead, I want you to imagine a series of small trails, sometimes roads, linking different points along the way, different trading centers along the way. So trade then, like today, spread ideas, art, language, the use of natural resources because they were often used in trade. Think precious metals like gold and silver, gems, spices, wool, silk, etc. As more people traded, cities became bigger and bigger, and safe ways to hold money had to be developed. Banks, credit, and other money systems started to be developed. People with money started investing in trading companies. The big religions also spread during Big Era 5. This image shows how these religions spread. The pink arrows show Buddhism, the orange Christianity, the yellow Hinduism, and green Islam. There's a great short video of this spread in your World Religions and Philosophies assignment, so make sure you check that out. It's a lot better than this map because it's actually showing the movement a little bit better. But you can see how, or at least in what direction, these religions started to move and how extensive they were. Who are the major players in the spread of these religions? Well, Buddhist monks along the Silk Road, Muslim traders, Christian missionaries. You might have noticed that Judaism isn't represented in the spread of universal religions during this period, even though you know that Judaism was the start of Christianity and Islam. The reason is because Judaism at that time was passed through one's mother. So you couldn't convert to Judaism. They didn't have missionaries. You were born Jewish if your mother was Jewish. That made the spread of Judaism limited, though we do see the movement of Jewish people during this time and later in other big eras. We just don't see quite the movement that we see in the other major religions during this time. So religion was important to cultural exchange for a few reasons. Members of one faith, say Islam for instance, would have something in common with other people, other Muslims, even if they were different ethnicities. If they spoke different languages and were living in different parts of the world, they would still have something in common. Religious scholars of all the religions would gather and record knowledge and start schools. Art, literature, and philosophy, even science, were all associated with religion at this time, and as religion spread, so did the ideas. So what were some of the ideas and technologies that were exchanged across Afro-Eurasia? Libraries, schools, and astronomy. So even just the ideas of having libraries and schools was exchanged. not to mention the ideas within the libraries and the ideas within the schools. Natural sciences. And these are important for navigation as well. Stern rudder and lateen sail, which allowed for ocean-going trade and exploration. This is going to be huge in the next few big eras. Map making, which allowed routes to be documented and made trade and exploration safer. Also made the scope of empires readily available, so you could determine how extensive your empire was. Books and paper, which allowed knowledge to be contained and disseminated. Now remember, these books, though, were handwritten at this time. We still didn't have a printing press, so the books were extremely valuable. Camel saddles and horse stirrups, which made long-distance travel much more comfortable and convenient, which helped with the movement of people. And the astrolabe, which was an instrument in navigating via the stars. Water was and is essential to growing populations, and during Big Era 5, hydraulic systems expanded, irrigation expanded, and water was used more and more for energy production using water wheels. These would often power trip hammers, which allowed for the automatic pounding, grinding, and milling of grain, etc., along with windmills, which helped with the pumping of the water for irrigation. Food is a great example of cultural diffusion or cultural exchange. Just look at the United States and the restaurants available to us, or the kinds of foods we typically think of as American. Indian food, Chinese food, Mexican food, pizza, Thai, barbecue, etc., all came from other places. Grains like sorghum moved from Africa to China. Citrus fruits like lemons and limes moved from Southwest Asia to Spain. Cane sugar moved from India to the Mediterranean and would, in Big Era 6, contribute to the global slave trade when it moved to the Americas. Cotton moved from India to northern Africa, to Central Asia and China, and vegetables also made their way across Afro-Eurasia. Though these agricultural items were exchanged, sometimes regional climate differences made it impossible for some things to grow in certain areas. How did the cultural exchange impact everyday people? Innovation increased, knowledge increased, crafting and farming productivity increased, diets and health improved, and sea travel and transportation opportunities increased. If you were to characterize Big Era 5 with just one word, it might be connected. The connections created advanced humanity during this era. So we've been talking this whole time about Afro-Eurasia. What about the Americas? They were fairly isolated still during Big Era 5. That will change when Columbus makes contact in 1492. And we'll talk about that in Big Era 6. But for now, not only were the Americas isolated from Afro-Eurasia, they were also isolated from each other. Despite that, they were still creating networks of exchange within their regions. And here we have the major regions of empire in South America, Central America, and Northern America. So we have here So we have here the Incas. Up here we have the Aztecs and the Mayan states. And we have networks of exchange between these areas within the region. But we don't have a whole lot of interregional exchange between regions in the Americas at this point. In Central and South America, the Maya, Inca, and Aztec empires were developing trade routes, mining technologies, crops like potatoes, corn, tomatoes, chocolate, specific to the Americas, were grown, and sciences like astronomy, mathematics, and engineering were developing. In Big Era 6, we will be exploring why, despite the technologies and innovations happening in the Americas, they were so far behind their Afro-Eurasian counterparts. Here's a map of the states and empires existing in the Americas in 1500, really at the beginning of Big Era 6. So again, here's where the Incas were. Here's the Aztec Empire and the Mayan states in the 1500s, really at the beginning of the Big Era 6. So during the 1500s, represented by the map in the previous slide, Europeans like Columbus made it to these American civilizations, and that would link the world globally, which is what we're going to be looking at in Big Era 6. It was the technological advances that happened because of cultural exchange in Afro-Eurasia that made that transatlantic voyage to the Americas possible. And again, we will be exploring what happened when the world was linked globally in Big Era 6. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions, come see me as soon as you can.